In the quiet suburban town of Covington, Georgia, where everyone's business was everyone's entertainment, the story of Miles Carter and his wife Ebony unfolded in a way that no one could have predicted. It began as a love story, one whispered about at church activities and neighborhoods, before it turned into the kind of tragedy that kept the small community glued to their television sets for weeks. Miles Carter, 32 years, was the kind of man mothers pointed out to their daughters as marriage material. Tall, soft-spoken and hard-working, he worked as a mechanic at the local auto shop, where he was known for fixing more than just cars. He had a way of fixing people too, listening to their worries, providing advice, or simply cracking a joke to lighten their day. But behind his easygoing behavior, Miles was searching for something more. A wonderful partner, someone to spend his life with. Someone who would fill the void left by years of fleeting relationships and broken hearts. When he met Ebony at a friend's barbecue, it was as if the universe had finally answered his prayers. Ebony, 28, was charming and captivating, the kind of woman who made you forget where you were for a moment. She carried herself with a confidence that made heads turn wherever she went, her laughter and smile rising above like the song of a beautiful rare bird. Her dark skin glistened in the sun that day, and her eyes carried a spark that made Miles's chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. By the end of the evening, he had her number, and their whirlwind romance began. Over the next few days, their love was so intoxicated, they were so attached to each other. Ebony worked as a stylist at a high-end salon in Atlanta and often teased Miles about how she could make him. She brought out a side of him he didn't know he had, trying new foods, going to art galleries, and even salsa dancing. Their love was a storm of passion and intensity, culminating in a proposal just 6 months after they met. In the weeks that followed, their connection grew like ivy on an old brick wall, so strong and unwavering. Miles found himself texting her often and wanting to always talk with her. By the 3rd month, Miles was convinced he wanted to marry her, so he started by introducing her to his family. By the 6th month, he was down on one knee, proposing in a quiet park under the stars. Ebony, beautifully dressed with a beaming smile on her face, said yes, and just like that, Miles believed his life was finally falling into place. Held in the backyard of Miles's childhood home, family and friends gathered under a canopy of string lights, clinking glasses and swaying to the sounds of an old R&B playlist. Miles's best friend Jamal gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. Ebony looked radiant in her white dress, her hand never leaving Miles's throughout the night. The wedding was small but stunning. The ceremony was held in the backyard of Miles's childhood home, with fairy lights strung between the trees and folding chairs occupied by the people who were invited. Ebony wore a simple white dress, her natural curls adorned with delicate pearls. Miles couldn't stop staring at her, as if she were some celestial being he'd been lucky enough to call his wife. Miles's best friend, Jamal, gave a toast that had everyone laughing. After the wedding, life settled and reality also settled. Ebony moved into Miles's house. She filled the spaces with her favorite candles, fluffy rugs, and framed pictures of their growing memories together. For a while, it did. The newlyweds settled into their routine, their days filled with the mundane joys of married life. They cooked dinner together, argued over what to watch on Netflix, and spent lazy Sundays in bed talking about their expectations and future. On Saturdays, they'd tackle home improvement projects together, painting walls and rearranging furniture, dreaming about the future they were building. One happy memory, Miles talked often about having children, imagining what their son or daughter might look like, whether they'd inherit Ebony's cheekbones or his hair. Ebony always smiled at these moments, though there was a hesitation in her eyes that he chose to ignore. But beneath the surface, Ebony carried a secret, one she had buried deep, one she feared would destroy everything she and Miles had built. She was transgender. Assigned male at birth, Ebony had transitioned in her early 20s, leaving behind a past she rarely spoke of. To her, the woman she was now was the only truth that mattered. She believed, perhaps naively, that love could conquer all, even this. It was during one of those quiet Sundays that Miles stumbled upon a dark secret: a shoebox. Miles had been tidying up while Ebony showered when he stumbled upon an old shoebox tucked away in the back of her closet. What he found instead made his breath catch. It seems you're enjoying our documentary. You can keep in touch with more interesting videos by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and a birth certificate bearing a name he didn't recognize: Eric Jameson. At first he thought it was a mistake. Perhaps these belonged to someone else, a relative or a friend. But as he flipped through the contents, the truth became undeniable. The letters detailed Ebony's transition, her struggles, her surgery journey, and her decision to leave her old life behind. Miles felt heavy. It was as though the room spun. When Ebony emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around her body, she found Miles sitting on the edge of the bed, the shoebox at his feet. His face was filled with betrayal. "Who is Eric Jameson?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ebony froze. Her heart raced as she realized what had happened. She sat beside him, tears welling in her eyes, and told him everything. She spoke of her childhood, her transition, and her fear of losing him if he knew. "I love you, Miles," she said. "That's all that matters. This doesn't change who I am." Miles moved to the couch, his nights spent staring at the ceiling as he tried to make sense of the revelation. Ebony, for her part, gave him space, though the distance between them felt like a chasm. Miles couldn't reconcile with the truth he had discovered. He felt betrayed, as if the foundation of their relationship had been built on lies. Ebony had always been honest about who she was in the present, but the past she had kept hidden gnawed at him. At work, Miles struggled to focus. He confided in Jamal, whose reaction was exactly the confusion Miles felt. Jamal didn't judge outright, but his advice was far from helpful. "Man, that's heavy," Jamal had said during their lunch break. "I don't even know what I'd do if I were you. You gotta figure out what you can live with." What Miles couldn't live with was the silence. He wanted answers, explanations, something to bridge the gap between the life he thought he had and the reality he now faced. Yet, every time he tried to bring it up, words failed him. Ebony too was struggling. She had always known this day might come, but the reality of it was more painful than she had imagined. She loved Miles deeply, but she also understood that the truth of her past was something he might never accept. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the Carter household deepened. Miles became consumed by an internal storm that neither work nor time could calm. The truth he had uncovered seemed to cling to him like a shadow, and he found himself revisiting the contents of the box almost every night. He couldn't deny the love he still felt for Ebony, but that love was now filled with twists and tangled with questions, doubts, and fears he couldn't understand. How could the woman he had married, the woman he had shared his life with, have kept such a huge secret? Ebony, on the other hand, was living in a perpetual state of dread. She could see the pain in Miles' eyes, the way he recoiled when she tried to talk to him. She had always believed that her past didn't matter, but now, for the first time, she felt as though it might. The tension between them came to a head one evening when Miles finally broke his silence. It wasn't a conversation, much like an eruption, a flood of piled-up frustration and confusion that spilled out of him in a torrent. "How could you not tell me?" he demanded, pacing the living room while Ebony sat silently on the couch. "How could you marry me, knowing this?" Ebony didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, though her hands trembled in her lap. "Because I loved you," she said simply. Miles couldn't meet her gaze. "But you lied to me," he shot back. This isn't something you keep from someone you're supposed to spend the rest of your life with." The conversation ended with Miles storming out of the house, leaving Ebony alone in the silence. In the days that followed, Miles began to withdraw from everyone. He avoided Jamal's calls, skipped family dinners, and spent hours driving aimlessly through the quiet streets of Covington. He was a man untethered, grappling with a reality he couldn't reconcile. At work, his performance suffered. His boss, A gruff but fair man named Mr. Colton called him into the office after a particular meeting. "You're not yourself, Carter," Mr. Colton said, his voice tinged with concern. "Whatever's going on, you need to figure it out. Don't let it ruin your life." Miles nodded mutely, but the words didn't sink in. His life already felt ruined. Ebony, meanwhile, tried to hold on to some amount of normalcy. She threw herself into her work at the salon, hoping the distraction would ease the ache in her chest. But every evening, she returned to an empty home and the weight of a marriage that was breaking before her eyes. One night, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She wrote Miles a letter, pouring out her heart in an attempt to explain the choices she had made and the person she had become. She left the letter on the kitchen table, hoping it would serve as a bridge between them. When Miles found it, he didn't read it. He crumpled the paper in his hand and threw it into the trash, too consumed by his anger and hurt to see the gesture for what it was. The breaking point came on a stormy September night. The rain poured heavily against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees as Miles and Ebony found themselves face to face in the living room. Miles had been drinking, the empty bottles on the counter a proof of the state he was in. Ebony could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, and for the first time, she felt afraid. "We need to talk," Miles said, his voice low and unsteady. Ebony nodded, though her heart raced. "Okay," she replied, but the conversation quickly spiraled out of control. Miles's words were sharp and cutting, each one landing like a blow. He accused her of deceit, of betrayal, of ruining the life they had built together. Ebony tried to defend herself, to explain that her past didn't change the love she had for him or the life they could still have, but Miles wasn't listening. He was too lost in his pain to hear anything she said. As the argument escalated, the storm outside seemed to dance to the tune of the chaos inside. The air crackled with tension, and the room felt suffocating. And then, in a moment of blind rage, it happened. Miles grabbed a kitchen knife, his anger boiling over into something he couldn't control. Ebony screamed, but it was too late. Blinded by anger and frustration, he stabbed Ebony several times until she was unconscious. When the rage subsided, he stood over her lifeless body, the knife clutched in his trembling hand. The realization of what he had done hit him like a freight train. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for her, as if he could undo the irreversible. But it was too late. Ebony was gone. For a long time, Miles sat there in the silence, the storm outside raging on. He couldn't comprehend what he had done, couldn't process the reality of the situation. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, was gone, and it was his fault. Eventually, he stood and stumbled into the bathroom. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him. When the police arrived, called by a concerned neighbor who had heard the noise and cries, they found Miles sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He didn't resist as they placed him in handcuffs. The trial that followed was fast and brutal. Miles pled guilty, unable to muster the energy to fight the charges. The courtroom was filled with friends and family, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. The trial was fast, with Miles receiving a life sentence for second-degree murder. But for Miles, none of it mattered. He had lost the woman he loved, and no amount of explanation or justification could change that. As the judge handed down the sentence of life in prison, Miles felt a strange sense of relief. He knew he deserved to pay for what he had done, and perhaps in doing so, he could find some semblance of redemption. Ebony's memory haunted him, a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. He often found himself staring at the small window in his cell, the light filtering through like a distant hope he would never reach. Miles knew he would never forgive himself, and he didn't expect anyone else to, either. In the small, tight-knit community of Covington, the murder sent shockwaves that rippled far beyond the city limits. People whispered in grocery stores and exchanged glances at church services. The details of the crime, combined with the layers of Ebony's past, became the fuel for endless speculation, but no one truly understood what had transpired behind the closed doors of the Carter household. Miles became the subject of both condemnation and pity. To some, he was a monster, a man who had destroyed a life because of his own inability to cope with the truth. To others, he was a victim of circumstance, pushed to the brink by a revelation he hadn't been prepared to face. The media seized upon the story, spinning it into sensational headlines. Ebony's identity was exposed in ways that reduced her to nothing more than a symbol, erasing the complexities of her life and the love she had shared with Miles. For Ebony's family, the loss was immeasurable. Her mother, a strong and resilient woman, struggled to reconcile the vibrant daughter she had raised with the tragedy that had unfolded. She grieved not just for Ebony, but for the future that had been stolen from her. A future where she might have continued to thrive, love, and build a life on her terms. In prison, Miles was an anomaly. He wasn't like the hardened criminals who surrounded him, men who had long since accepted the brutality of their circumstances. He was quiet, introspective, and utterly consumed by guilt. He worked in the prison library, organizing books and occasionally reading when he could muster the focus. But even in those quiet moments, his mind would wander back to Ebony. He thought about the day they met, the way her laughter had filled the room and drawn him in. He thought about their wedding day, the way she had looked at him with so much love and trust. And he thought about that final stormy night, the moment when everything had unraveled beyond repair. Miles rarely spoke to the other inmates. When he did, it was in short, clipped sentences, his voice devoid of emotion. They quickly learned to leave him alone, sensing that he carried a burden too heavy for anyone else to share. Over time, Miles began to write. At first, it was just a way to pass the hours, a method of untangling the thoughts that churned endlessly in his mind. But the more he wrote, the more he realized it was his only way of making sense of what had happened. He wrote about his childhood, growing up in a small house with a mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. He wrote about the first time he saw Ebony, her radiant smile lighting up the room. He wrote about their life together, the joy and the laughter, the small moments that had made their marriage feel unbreakable. And he wrote about the night he had destroyed it all, laying bare the pain and confusion that had driven him to that unimaginable act. His writings, raw and unfiltered, found their way to a prison chaplain who encouraged him to share them with the world. Reluctantly, Miles agreed, and the essays were published anonymously in a local newspaper. To his surprise, the response was overwhelming. Readers were moved by the honesty of his words, the way he had stripped away the layers of his own humanity to reveal the broken man beneath. Some offered forgiveness, while others offered only scorn. But for Miles, the act of writing became a lifeline, a way to confront the demons that haunted him. Outside the prison walls, Ebony's memory lived on. Her friends and family refused to let her be defined by the tragedy of her death. They celebrated her life, her accomplishments, and the courage it had taken for her to live authentically in a world that often didn't understand her. A scholarship was established in her name, providing opportunities for young women in the community to pursue their dreams. Ebony had always believed in the power of education, and the scholarship became a testament to her enduring spirit. Her story also sparked conversations about identity, acceptance, and the complexities of love. Years passed, but the wounds left by the crime never fully healed. For those who had loved Ebony, the loss remained a constant ache, a reminder of the fragility of life and the destructive power of secrets. For Miles, the years behind bars were a slow, painful reckoning. He continued to write, pouring his thoughts onto paper in a futile attempt to make sense of the senseless. He knew he would never find peace, but he also knew he couldn't stop searching for it. The world moved on, as it always does, but the story of Miles and Ebony Carter lingered in the minds of those who had been touched by it. It was a story of love and betrayal, of pain and redemption, of how the past can shape the present in ways we can't always predict. In the end, it was a story without heroes or villains, only people, flawed, complicated, and human. And perhaps that was the most tragic part of all.